Bad Mondays. By Handyman. Chapter 14. A quiet moment. Handy woke up in an incredibly foul mood. His head was pounding something awful and he turned irritably in his, yet again, too small cot to see the errant claw of some griffin or other in the bunk above him lying over the side near where he had been resting his head. He gave the bunk above him a tremendous kick, launching the bird from his slumber and onto the floor. He chewed out the unfortunate guard good and proper about the correct bunkroom etiquette of not kicking the guy sleeping beneath you in your sleep. He stumbled over to his rota after reaffixing his helmet and putting his cloak and cuirass back on, having slept in his mail and wrapped a portion of his cloak about his neck. Hey, you can't blame him for being too careful. Did you see this castle at night? It's crawling with night ponies, thestrals, vamp horses, whatever one felt like calling them. Fucking bats. The day, or rather night for Handy, having woken up close to 6 in the evening in preparation for night shift duties. Apparently, his absence had been noted in passing by one of the princesses during a rare moment of tactful, polite, and respectful conversation during breakfast, or so Joachim had told him during a recess when he arrived to take over the shift of one of the other nights. The deliberations had been going on all day, literally hours on end. Thankfully there had been no passionate explosions of diplomatic folly such as the previous day's dinner. Johann had looked worse for wear, utterly exhausted and glad to talk to someone who clearly did not give a flying fuck about the affairs in question. Handy dropped his airs for the sake of talking to the bird normally, well, normal for talking to Joachim that is. The king appreciated the gesture and proceeded to engage in polite conversation about literally anything and everything else, if it meant Handy could take a break from talking like a royal page in Henry Tudor's court. For once he was all for indulging the bird in his exasperating venting. You know, I'd call the ponies of Canterlot supercilious, but I've been to Old Mount, so I'll be kind and just describe them as having a particularly long gerlach stick shoved up their backsides. I mean, how else could they keep their heads upturned all day like that? Look at them. Handy had snorted at that, then coughed to try to hide the laugh. For your reference, gerlach is a stick-using sport performed by Pegasi and griffins on frozen clouds, basically sky hockey if hockey were played like hurley. Handy was entirely in approval of the violent sport and referenced the similarity between it and two sports humans played. It was then that Joachim had asked about the meeting with Princess Twilight. So spill, what exactly did you do to the little one? He asked. Handy looked at him. Do? I didn't do anything. Luna was asking about your whereabouts at breakfast. There was a curious look on Celestia's face when she inquired. Ah, right, I see they've already had a look over Twilight's notes. Notes? Joachim, I was in that room with her for hours. She took a lot of notes about what I said and I know she would have kept me there all night grilling me for more information had I let her. I certainly had more to say. What did you tell her? Oh, you know, this and that. And the little secret. Hey, if it makes the ponies feel more awkward that their own batty pals couldn't keep their fangs to themselves, I don't see a reason to keep it a secret from them. Handy said. Joachim had frowned at that. That could prove difficult, couldn't you have kept that under wraps? Our fella, what was there to keep under wraps? The princesses know I bit a pony already, now they know why, and it's their fault. Sides, half of the people who've actually met me already suspect the truth, most of the rest consider it a possibility with some credence and the rest. Well, let's just say ponies gossip like they've got nothing better to do. I have so many goddamn rumors floating around I might as well try to dispel some of the unsavory ones. And being a bloodsucker is not unsavory. Okay, I'll be honest. I just felt like fucking with her head. I spent so long in the interview dispelling some of the rumors about me, I felt like confirming one by way of compromise to throw her for a loop. Keep the ponies guessing. Also her reactions were priceless, I didn't know ponies could blush that hard. Allmaker, what did you say to her? A lot of things, it's not my fault she doesn't get out more. You're one to talk because neither do you, at least not when you can get away with it. I like my privacy. Privacy is one thing, getting people flustered is something else. I never seen you treating Enigrafon like that before, why did you do it to her? Oh come on, I just messing around. Alexei dearest put me on the spot, so I figured I might as well have some fun with it. I was just curious how close I could get to her neck before anything bad happened, vampirish dickery you know, but I am certainly not telling you that. Joachim said deadpanned, clearly not entirely sold. It always amused Handy how hard it was to convince Joachim of something, either he's just extraordinarily perceptive or just more cynical than most. The bird looked up at the sky, the sun was getting awfully low towards the horizon, he sighed. Well, back to the grindstone, Celestia mentioned a change to Equestria's tariffs. Thunderstorm is running her through the ringers on the particulars, a bloody diplomatic dragnet and the rest of us are getting caught up in it, it's going to be a late one. Joy of joys, let me put on my happy face. Handy sighed. You're wearing a helmet. Like I said, my happy face. Dash equals dash. Handy was not wearing his happy face. The hall was sweltering, the diplomatic talks had gone into hardball territory. Thankfully it lacked the bellicosity of the previous day's talks. A brief chat with a rather senior-looking knight in the High King's contingent proved illuminating in this regard. Apparently this was par for the course, the childish squabbling that started off the talks between Griffin and Pony rulers often calmed down, in tone if not in spirit, as both sides often used hardball tactics to get the other to concede on some of the pettiest points of contention. Celestia's tactic of causing the ambient temperature of the room to heighten while retaining the moisture caused an incredibly clammy and humid, not to mention uncomfortable experience. It was apparently old hat too, she was known for this. The Griffins were visibly uncomfortable, but they coped through it with a bloody mindedness Handy approved of, still cursed them for their stupidity, but approved in the long run. High King's Alexei still had that damn smile of his. He was surprised to learn that this kind of immaturity only occurred between the dealings of these two kingdoms and was considered something of a geopolitical joke in the wider international community, like how Russians are as welcoming and lovable as drunken bears, or how America's a free country. It had something to do with how the two countries had fierce wars earlier in their history, and the tradition of difficult negotiation over splitting hairs was the result of some kind of fantasy Cold War that has long since thawed out into reasonably warm relations. How long has it been like this? 1,000 fucking years. So yeah, an old joke. The knight had mentioned offhand that Celestia was often like this during such meetings throughout that time, and that Griffonian High Kings had an entire year's worth of their education dedicated to just dealing with pony princesses without losing their royal shit and lashing out. Princess Luna was a new addition however, and considered something of a wild card, but Alexei seemed to be coping. Handy had scoffed lightly. Really? The ponies had called their rulers Celestia for 1,000 straight years? He had thought France was ridiculous with its Louis and the church a bit too fond of the name Benedict, but hot damn, ponies don't fuck around with regal naming, probably got rid of the tradition of regal numerals altogether because they were getting too high as far as the human knew. That knowledge, however, was no comfort. He had taken off his helmet and thrown back his hood, trying not to breath too heavy as the sweat poured down his face. The other knights and pony guards had taken to leaning against the walls or even sitting down on the floor, the dignitaries at the table and the attendant servants not making a fuss about the lack of professionalism in this instance, a silent, collective agreement of fuck decorum having been put into effect. Handy had lasted longer than most of his fellows before running out of all the professional, weapons-grade fucks he had to give. He was wearing his cloak and armor and standing under several burning torches. Granted, they were very fancy torches attached to the walls with delicate and equally fancy metal sconces, but holy shit did they burn bright and furiously. You'd think the dampness of the air would lessen it, right? Handy thought so. Handy was wrong. Several heads turned when he took off his helmet, evidently curious as to what he looked like without it on. He couldn't give a shit by that point and let them look away. It had went on like this for the next 3 days. They had sorted out the specifics of all of their current trading negotiations, came to reasonable consensus on change of local and national laws which affected each other's revenue and even made arrangements for new treaties and deals which would increase the prosperity of both kingdoms, and everything was sunshine and fucking rainbows. Literally, there had been rainbows all day, minus rain, and Handy couldn't for the life of him figure out why until he eventually shrugged saying, "Fuck it, probably Pegasi or some shit." "So, you'd think he'd be happy, right?" He managed to avoid getting neck-deep by the Thestrals in the castle or being nuked by the magical princesses, and Twilight had not bothered him again. As he thought of it, the purple pony had been keeping her distance, while occasionally stealing glances from under Celestia's wings, so to speak. He must have frightened her more than he had intended. It didn't help that he swore he was being followed at times by a green-eyed Thestral, probably a spy the sisters sent. However, no, Handy was not happy. Handy was incredibly foul of mood and temperament, getting worse the longer he stayed in the castle. Long nights standing guard in humid drawing rooms and nervous checking of every shadow during his nightly rounds in the guest wing, coupled with waking up every goddamn morning with a thunderous headache which only seemed to be getting worse each day, tends not to do any favors for one's mood. It was all he could do, to not lash out at some poor bastard, so he avoided all conversation. It was the final night of negotiations, allowing for 2 days for the visiting delegation to relax and enjoy the city before returning home. Handy for one could not wait, having grown incredibly tired of the glares of the ponies and the odd looks from the princesses. It was the final night of deliberations, clarifying final points as the representatives and the princesses finished their meals. Also, it was still humid because if you've been childish this long, might as well finish what you started, right? It was all good otherwise. However, ponies and griffins had calmed down. No more shouting, no more snide remarks and backhanded compliments, no more of the fuckery of diplomatic, feather-encrusted horse dung that had haunted the talks and made Handy's life that much more unbearable. Goldtooth, the king of Furthingart? Yet, he's now rightfully earned his place pretty fucking high on Handy's shit list because of his interminable ramblings and constant complaints. And I believe that's all we need to discuss. Anything else? Celestia's beatific smile showed no sign of the strain she no doubt had to be experiencing. There was a general murmur from the gathered kings before Oleski spoke up. "I believe that is all we have to bring to the table. Our thanks for your most gracious hospitality and understanding in these affairs." He beamed. There is a God. Thank fuck this is all over, Handy thought, allowing himself an exasperated sigh. Luna was looking at him out of the corner of his eye. Again. He had gotten used to all the evil glances she had been sending his way, but even so, it was still grating on his nerves. The royals got up from their places at the table and chatted amiably with each other as if that week of hell had never happened, the humidity, finally, relenting and something resembling a sane temperature returned to the room. Handy stood back to attention, looking over to Joachim to see if he was ready to lean up. Luna was engaging him in conversation as the High King and the King of the Hebridean Isles traded some last-minute pleasantries while Goldtooth and his contingent left the room. And he had been looking forward to getting out of there too. His head turned back to its normal position as he sighed. It was then that Handy regretted the one universal problem of wearing a full-face helm, a severely restricted peripheral vision. As he turned, he noticed a strand of multi-hued hair, floating on a breeze all of its own just in front of him. The human started visibly, only just noticing the alicorn standing beside him. How in the hell does something like her sneak up on anyone? Can I help thee, Majesty?" he blurted as he took a step back in surprise. The Princess of the Sun regarded the human curiously. She was definitely taller than Chrysalis, matching Handy's own height if you discounted her horn length, perhaps a shave taller. She looked at him for an uncomfortable moment before finally speaking. "May I speak with you, Sir Handy?" she asked. "Shit." Handy turned back to Joachim, still distracted talking to the other princess. "Damn it," he turned back to Celestia. "I would of course grant thy request, Majesty, but I must be ready to attend to my lord," he said hopefully. She smiled. He frowned. I respect your diligence, but your king is plenty safe right now. Oh no, he was prepared for that, besides, I only wish to hear about your exploits from yourself, I do so enjoy stories. Well, okay, that's hard, and I wish to apologize to you personally for the trouble we put you through. It will only take a minute, please, if you would be so kind to indulge a tired mare's curiosity. Goddamn woman, he can't really back out of that without causing a scene. He felt eyes upon him, damn it. Of course, Majesty. He relented, gritting his teeth. He bowed his head slightly as she beamed at him. He followed the Solar Princess through a pair of double doors at one end of the hall, casting one look over his shoulder at a rather surprised-looking Joachim. There were rather a lot of day guards down the corridor they took. They were up late, he noted, but he preferred them to the thestrals. He was ushered into a surprisingly plain-looking room. It was well lit with a collection of large cushions in the center, and the curtains were drawn on the full wall-length window. Handy had to surrender his weapon and shield, an understandable precaution given the princess had no guards in the room with her. Well, someone's certainly confident. Handy knew better than to be cocky, however. You could feel the magic coming from this pony, she was clearly not to be fucked with. Celestia walked over to the window before turning to face the human. He felt awkward standing there as the door closed just behind him. There was nowhere to sit after all, and the princess was just studying him. He felt like coughing to try to push the conversation along, but thought better of it. After what felt like an age, the princess walked over to him, stopping a mere foot from him before her horn lit up. "And water?" she asked with a smile. Handy almost faltered. A cup of water levitated before him. Where in the hell did she get that? He realized he was just standing there before he reacted. Yes. My thanks, Majesty," Handy said, reaching for the cup. He then realized in order to actually drink it, he'd need to take off his helm. He tapped his finger on the cup for a moment before deciding to do just that. Okay, I'm impressed, princess, very clever, he thought, removing his helmet and hood, therefore removing whatever psychological advantage he had in robbing the princess of seeing the expressions on his face. He held the helmet in the crook of his arm and drank. It was actually incredibly delicious and refreshing, especially after those final few hours in that hot box of a dining hall. He drained the cup before looking back at the princess, who was now reclining across the large pillows. "Please, have a seat," she said politely. Handy looked to his right and left. There was nothing for him to sit on. He looked back and saw only the gentle smile gracing the features of the Sun Princess. He looked down at the floor and, with as much grace and dignity as he could in full armor, he lowered to the floor. He'd normally sit cross-legged, but that really wasn't an option in those greaves, so he had to sit with his knees up to his chest, forcing him to put his helmet on the floor beside him, and left Celestia looking down at him. He fumed. The position made him feel awkward and lanky, which is a feeling he was often reminded of during daily life nowadays, but he preferred not to experience it when he could help it. Okay, Celestia, out with it, he thought. The condemnations, thou, how dare you bite one of my little ponies, oh my, they. I want you know that from the very depths of my heart, and that of my sister, we are sorry for what we have done to you, she said solemnly. Handy blinked in surprise. He honestly had not expected an apology of any sort. However, she continued, more sternly this time, we cannot overlook your previous transgressions, even with the pardon. Ah, there we go. Forgive me, Majesty, Handy began. Bulletin. I am not referring to the petty indiscretion in the West or your assault of my guards, she said. Well, Luna's guards to be precise, she added. Handy tried not to frown at the interruption. I am referring to your alliance with the Queen of the Changelings. Alliance? What would you call it? Almost killing her, Handy admitted. Celestia blinked rapidly. She recomposed herself and lowered her gaze for a moment before speaking again. It appears I do not fully understand your relationship with the changelings. Gee, who'da thunk? I believe that would be fair to say, Majesty. He said in response. Very well then, Celestia said, levitating a letter from under a wing and reading it over once more before looking back at the human, her head not turning from the page. I will be honest, I cannot let you leave this castle until I know, exactly, what happened in the Badlands. And risk causing an incident with Gethriania. Majesty, I do not think even thee would care for that much trouble considering the week that has just gone by. Her gaze narrowed, Handy's smile widened, he then cleared his throat and elected to indulge the princess. When I arrived in the Badlands, I was captured by the changelings, not knowing what I was after I arrived in their city. City? She asked, an eyebrow raised. Yes, quite a lovely place too, they had abandoned it for a long time, I didn't know that at the time however. So they captured you? Yes, a scout that had found me was concerned that she could not feed off of me, indeed, apparently could not even sense me until she tripped across my feet. He said, he felt the pendant warm up considerably under his mail, looks like someone does not appreciate him talking about her so openly. He spent nearly a week wandering the castle giving the queen a good look, the least she could do is shut up long enough for Handy to get his own arse out of hot water. Where did they take you? To a pod of sorts. Handy said, Celestia nodded. They tried to induce sleep in me and cause me to dream, allowing them to learn and feed off of me by dreaming of my loved ones. They failed, so they tried numerous chemical concoctions, causing a great deal of suffering and pain for myself. Celestia looked, concerned. It did not work. No, even if it did cause me to sleep, I could not dream. Why not? Because I simply do not. Never have, he responded. This seemed to surprise Celestia immensely. She recovered and tapped her chin with a hoof, looking aside. That would explain it. Majesty. Nothing, please, what did you do? The room I was in the Queen's palace. The building was under attack, the Queen entered the room seeking a secret passage. She drew near my pod, which was when I made my escape and attacked her. How did you escape? I ate. You? Why you ate your way out? I was hungry, and not in my right mind I pray thee understand, also the pod was delicious. He added, he enjoyed watching the princess try not to squirm. Herbivores, pfft. My rage was great and my reason had left me, so I nearly killed the queen before I came to my senses. Handy looked uneasily to the side, Celestia's eyes narrowed. I suppose I can understand. Celestia said, Handy did not believe her as much as he wanted to. I regret my actions, he added uneasily. She tortured you. There is no excuse, Handy said, looking down, a quizzical expression graced her features, she looked as if she was about to speak further before Handy beat her to it. In either case, I managed to compel her to help me escape, we made it out into the city. Where we met the dragon. Dragon. Her eye widened. Yes. Handy said. Thou didst not think those rumors of mine killing a dragon were false, did thee? He asked, the look on her face told him she had indeed. Ponies will willingly believe I have eyes of burning coal and spawn from the shadow of a murdered phoenix sooner than believe a dragon can be slain? Thou put too much stock in the lords of flame. How? Pray. How did you kill it? A few well-placed hammer blows and a death ride down in dark chasm, to put it in short. Handy said simply. I had just saved the queen's life, she had paid me for my services. Paid you? Were you not just in a position to kill her previously? I was. Then why would she do that? To let me go and wander around Ponyland as her literal, unwitting eyes and ears. Because she asked for mine aid. He lied. And you gave it. I was a mercenary and an adventurer, it was a dragon, she was a client, I got paid. There is little sense bringing personal matters into business. Celestia seemed to consider all of this as she put the letter away. She levitated another cup of water and took a sip. She paid you a substantial amount for such a task, she said at length. I saved their ancestral city from the threat that caused them to leave it in the first place. Handy added. Also, I was not aware of the full value of the payment she did deliver unto me until later on when I entered Pa's town. I beg thy forgiveness, but I was ignorant of thine economy vis-a-vis the changeling currency, he added. Celestia looked at him hard before finally asking another question. So why are you here? She asked. I'm here as part of my lord's entourage. No. I meant here, you are quite far from home, she asked. Handy froze. He raised a gauntleted hand and idly scratched the side of his head while looking aside. Celestia raised an eyebrow curiously. It was indiscretion that led to my being here, Handy admitted. Indiscretion? She asked. Yes. It was. Is rather embarrassing. Now the princess was leaning her head over, eager to hear. Handy took a deep breath, sighing. He told Celestia the story of his drunken rampage that apparently lasted months. The room was quiet for a good long while after that. Handy shuffled uncomfortably. The princess' face almost broke as she raised a hoof to suppress a giggle. Handy's blood boiled. Okay, enough of this. Handy got back to his feet and bowed slightly. If that will be all, Majesty, he said. Celestia looked up, surprised. Actually, I had a few more things to ask, she insisted. Please, sit. Handy almost didn't. I have a request of you, she asked. Handy looked the horse dead in the eye for a few seconds before complying. I must request that, in the course of your duties, you bring no harm upon my little ponies, she said simply. Is she fucking serious? I am sorry, Majesty, Handy said, causing her to look up. That is simply a request I cannot abide by. Her gaze hardened. And why is that? Because thy little ponies, so far, have been more of a threat to my livelihood than I ever have been to theirs. Particularly after thy recent folly. Handy challenged. His blood was up and his reason tried desperately to restrain his pride from getting him into more trouble. There was a coolness in the air about them. Handy did not care. Thou hast apologized for thy assault of myself and my lord, which I do graciously accept. But I shall not fulfill any such request until you apologize for the curse thou hast unwittingly damned me with, he said heatedly. Celestia blinked. Damned? Didst thou not read thy students' writings? I am vampire now, because of the curse carried within the fangs of thy thestrals, he said. Already I have noted differences between myself and thy thestrals in my needs. Thou hast awoken in me a blood curse my people thought mere myth. I am now the shadow that haunts the minds of mankind. I pray for my sake and for all that it does not deteriorate further than it already has, he added. I'm sorry, she said, her anger from before fading. But, it should not be any more crippling than what the thestrals have to deal with. Perhaps, if you would allow us, we can assist you. Equestria can provide you with potions to subdue your thirst, perhaps even find a cure. Unless your thestrals can heal their wounds with the blood they drink, then I think it's fair to say I've already changed more radically than could be expected. I am sorry, Majesty, but I am afraid I cannot accept such aid, Handy retorted. Celestia looked back into his eyes. I will not be thrall to those who have left me so accursed. But, we would never do that to you. Oh? Even if thou wouldst not willingly, would that not be the case nonetheless? I would be reliant on thee for the supply of potions, would I not? He asked. She was silent. It was as he thought. He closed his eyes and took in a breath. Easy, Handy. Calm down. Thou hast been a most gracious host, Majesty. And thy offer is most generous, but I simply cannot accept, much like I cannot accept your hope of a cure. Had thee been able to find one, surely thy thestrals would be free of their taint by now. He reasoned. Celestia slowly got back to her hooves, prompting Handy to do the same. She looked at him hard, even if her eye did glisten with a bit of sadness. Yes. I suppose I should have expected as much, she said. But the issue still remains, you will not bring harm upon any of my ponies, Handy of Milesia, she said, almost possessively. Handy was about to respond before a goat's head popped out of the floor. Handy's reality broke as he looked down at it. Ah, there you are, Tia my dear. The goat's head spoke. It had two horns, one looked like a banjaxed antler and the other resembled an elongated unicorn horn that had gone through a cement mixer. Handy's mind continued to sunder as the head rose up as the mere tip of a long snake-like torso which bore the appendages of animals that had no business being on the same body. I've been just dying to speak to you about the dreadfully dull ambience in that restaurant you recommended. It spoke. Celestia's face was a confusion of emotions between anger, frustration, alarm, and surprise. Discord, she said through gritted teeth. I told you not to come to the castle this week. Oh, I know, but I have been just so terribly bored. Fluttershy is away on a trip, something about seapennies or some other thing I don't really care truthfully, I just oh hello. Oh God no. Handy took a step back instinctively, severely missing his hammer. The strange, floating, thing had twisted in the air to regard him. My, aren't you a strange one? Nope, don't care, too boring, ta-ta. The Draconequa snapped its leonine paw as it closed its eyes and Handy felt everything suddenly get very warm and bright. There was a flash of light. Discord turned back to Celestia. Now, Princess, we've some things to discuss. Now I know you said I could turn the forest on Mount Greathoof upside down on Tuesdays, but I was thinking. What are you gawking at? He said, referring to Celestia's open-mouthed expression. Discord turned with a bored expression that suddenly widened in surprise. The human's armor shone with incandescence before eventually fading, the repaired parts of his armor glowing red with ambient magical energy longer than the rest of the metal before fading. Handy stood there blinking the blindness out of his eyes as he fumbled with his helmet. I thought I said ta-ta? You know, goodbye, perhaps you'd like to be sent a bit further away. I hear the Crystal Empire is lovely this time of year. What? Handy said flatly. What? Celestia echoed, but for an entirely different reason. A snap of fingers, a flash of light, a still stupefied human looking up at an ancient spirit of chaos growing incredibly frustrated with his existence. Discord mused, rubbing the lower part of his chin. What? Handy said again, trying to process what manner of fuckery this was. Discord leant uncomfortable close, an eye closed, his mismatched larger one bulged alarmingly as an optician's glass popped up in front of it. And another, and several more until Handy found himself backing up against the wall as the horizontal stack of magnification lenses threatened to pierce the fabric of his helmet and poke him in the eye. Well, isn't this neat? Discord mused with a click of his teeth. What? Handy said again, blinking rapidly. Discord snapped again, Handy's cloak turned pink. What? Discord smiled, his prominent snaggletooth displayed for all to see. Discord. Celestia said warningly. This is Sir Handy. A human. Discord's face changed slowly, frowning. Really now? He asked. Never saw one before. He said. The door kicked in as a solar guard rushed in. Princess I snap. The guard's armor and weapon was now water, which splashed over the bamboozled pony, soaking him and causing him to slip on the floor with an audible oof. The other guards behind him thought twice about following after him. It's rude to interrupt, you know. Discord, please, I am in the middle of something. Celestia said again. I'll speak with you later. Oh fine. He said, pouting. Have fun with your new toy, but I still hold you to that promise about the cheesecakes," he said, crossing his arms and turning his head to the side. Celestia rolled her eyes. "Yes, of course," she said. "Now, if you'd be so kind." "I suppose," he sighed and exploded in a cloud of goat-headed moths, flapping their way happily out of the room. Handy turned to follow them as they left, looked down at the recovering guard pony, looked at his cloak, looked back at Celestia. "What?" was all that he could say. Celestia smiled apologetically at him. She dismissed the guard and her horn lit up as she closed the door and dried the floor. Handy still hadn't removed himself from the wall, trying to process what in the blithering blue fuck that was about. "I apologize, he can be difficult to deal with sometimes." Handy did not respond. Celestia cleared her throat. "Sir Handy, might I inquire something?" Handy nodded his head slowly, his mind elsewhere, trying to think about anything else other than whatever the hell that was. Thoughts like, how the fuck am I going to explain this cloak away now? Celestia had a thoughtful look on her face. "How is it," she continued, "you were able to resist his magic?" she asked. "Huh?" Handy said intelligently. Oh, I guess. My armor. The way it was forged, something about it." Celestia narrowed her eyes as a smile returned to her face. "Helped when fighting the elemental," Celestia cocked an eyebrow. "An elemental?" "On the train, there was a pony, unicorn, summoned an elemental with her witch fire, tried to kill me with lightning," he said. Celestia's face was unreadable. Her horn lit up, a previously invisible door in the wall opened, in it she withdrew a black cloak stained with mud and tears. It was rather unremarkable bar the small golden clasp depicting a clover and unicorn horn. "Was the pony wearing this?" she asked. Handy took the cloak and had a look over it. "See, you're not helping Sorka, can't you see I am mourning for my beloved cloak? And here you are handing me a pony cloak, a black one, classy." She was. Handy confirmed, looking the cloak over. Celestia gestured to the clasp, taking advantage of the human's bewilderment. "Does that word mean anything to you?" she asked. Handy looked at the clasp. Astucier, a French word by the way it rolled off the tongue, he had no idea what it meant. "No," Handy said truthfully. "What is it?" he asked, his mind on overdrive to catch up with the situation. It figured it might be in Handy's best interests to play ignorant to the similarities between the languages he has run into during his time here and those of his home. Celestia frowned. "Perhaps it is nothing," she said, magically taking the cloak away again. Handy looked up. The princess was smiling serenely again when she turned back to the human. "You said you are a mercenary, correct? An adventurer?" she asked. Handy sensed the danger. "Was," he said. "Oh no, I'm not falling for that. I am currently engaged in long-term employment, Majesty," he finished. "A shame," she said at last. She looked over her shoulder, as if she could see the sky past the curtains. "It seems I am needed." "It has been a pleasure, Sir Handy." "It has been an honor." "It has not." Celestia then opened the door and gestured that Handy could leave. Handy took a step forward. "Oh, and one more thing," Celestia said, causing Handy to pause and turn. Her eyes were sparkling and she looked like she could not contain a laugh. "Perhaps you are not as heartless as the changelings believe, you do, after all, wear yours quite openly," she said. Handy looked at her confusedly. "I thank you, Majesty," he said. "Oh no, thank you, Sir Handy." Okay, now it was obvious she was trying to hold down a laugh. Handy scowled. "I'll be sure to have Twilight alter her notes to represent this fact. I am sure Ain has better things to do," Handy said with as much calm as he could muster. His left fist shook beneath his cloak as he stood in the doorway. He could hear one of the day guards snickering behind him. Okay, whoever you are, as soon as I turn around I am memorizing your face and immortalizing it on my shitlist for eternity. Ain? Celestia asked. Handy turned back to her. He smiled. It appears Twilight has not been entirely honest with her mentor. Yes, Ain, ask Her Highness about it. He said. It should prove most enlightening. He turned and closed the door behind him with more force than was necessary. The two guards on either side of the doorway were looking away, curious expressions on their face. He turned and scanned the dozen or so guards lining this section of the hallway, all of them with odd expressions. Eeny, meeny, miny, one guard by one of the many windows in particular was shaking. He raised a hoof to his muzzle as he let out a short, sharp breath. His eyes were watering. M.O. Welcome to the shitlist, Mr. Short Muzzle with a distinctive mark under his left eye. You can check out any time you like but you can never leave. Handy walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing very loudly as he went. He could hear an echoing chortle from down the way he came. He fumed impotently. He stopped by a window and steadied himself against the Greek pillar beside it, looking out into the night sky, trying to work out the sheer rage he felt. Easy Handy, this day can't get that much worse. Now, remember how Handy only came to accept ponies could control the weather when he finally bothered to look up and see it demonstrated for him firsthand? Yet, Handy has never actually personally witnessed a sunrise or moonrise in Equestria, so he is still operating under the assumption that the world turns at a reasonable, consistent pace and that the pretty pony princesses cannot, in fact, move the heavenly bodies of the sun and the moon. You can see where this is going. He looks out across the lit city below, and sees a small form floating in the air above the castle. In the dying light he can just make it out as Luna, the second of the royal diarchy. Her horn lit up gloriously as her wings spread wide, her form levitated there and her eyes shone with incandescent light. The moon rose way faster than it had any business doing before it slowed to a normal pace. Handy's mind goddamn stopped. Dash equals dash. When he came to, he was still standing there, the moon was slightly higher in the sky, his mouth was agape. Had he not been wearing his helmet he probably would have caught some rather unfortunate flies. As it was, he was just standing there, in the middle of a hallway, in a hot pink cloak, gazing over the city below. For over an hour. Handy shook with impotent rage at the universe. He moved on suddenly, storming down the corridor, his mood murderous. He passed by a number of night guards, their normally hungry and angry looks softened and turned to looks of curiosity, bewilderment, and barely restrained laughter. He stopped at a corner before the turn to the guest wing and turned and glared at one such pony who was on the verge of tears. Do it! He warned. I dare you! Glaring at the pony, who for his part had stifled some of his laughter, but his eyes still glistened, trying to look anywhere else. I double dare you motherfoo! Hey there you are Handy! Handy turned at the voice. It was Sir Tanny Smore. The guys were wondering where you were, what? The griffin stopped as he saw Handy's cloak in the moonlight and the bat pony behind him trying very hard not to laugh uproariously, staring at the back of the human's cloak wide-eyed. You get a change of clothes there buddy. Handy glowered at the bird. One word, Handy warned. One goddamn word, Tanis, and I swear, right here, right now, in the corridor, I will end you. Of course, SNRK. The griffin held a claw up. I'm just saying, you know, he continued. Handy turned back to stare down at the bat pony who immediately stood to attention but was visibly shaking. And it wasn't from fear. Thestral, teal eyes, strong jaw, reddish mane, possibly brown, distinctive mark on nose, oh yes, I'll remember you little one. The color is quite fetching on you, Handy the Hardy. Tanny Smore snickered. Handy gave out a cry of frustration and drew his hammer. I warned you. I fucking warned you. Come re. Handy charged at the griffin who took flight and flew down the corridor. Just saying. You know. It's quite a change from your usual dress sense. You like change? Here, let me change your skull. I hear concave is quite a fetching dimension to have these days. The Thestral promptly lost his shit as the two charged off, but Handy already had one target. Shitlister number 93 can await his turn, right before Featherbrain and after this afternoon's breakfast. The two had went in a circle, awaking the nearby castle dwellers to their shenanigans as Handy tried his damnedest to catch the feathery asshole. One particular room Luna was having a chat with Twilight about the constellations when Celestia walked in. Oh, that would be so beautiful. Do you think the Ursa constellation would benefit though? It seems it would take away from it. Twilight asked, looking over Luna's sketches. Luna shook her head. It would do no such thing, magic. Placing those stars over there would help accent the nebulae I had planned for that area of the sky. Am I interrupting? Celestia asked as she interrupted. Twilight looked up happily and Luna greeted her sister with a warm smile. Not at all, Celestia. Luna and I were just discussing her designs for next cycle of the moon. Twilight said happily. Magic has been most insightful and helpful. Luna said. Celestia smiled warmly at them both. She opened her mouth to speak before being rudely interrupted herself. Take it easy, Handy. I warned you, Tanny S'more, I bloody warned you. It was just a joke. Look, we've all had a long day. Long day? Haha. Don't think I didn't notice you skimping the rota you lay about. Get back here. The pleasant conversation increased and decreased in volume as the pair thundered past the open door of the observatory's study, leaving a fair number of dumbfounded and laughing guard ponies in their wake. The princesses just looked out the door in surprise from where they stood. Twilight's ear flicked. Was that Handy? She asked. Celestia looked down at her curiously. Yes, I believe it was. I had an interesting conversation with him before Discord interrupted. Twilight, she asked. Twilight looked up. Who's Ain? Celestia asked, smiling. Twilight flattened her ears and looked away. She began, tapping her hoof awkwardly on the floor. ===. Handy dragged Tanny S'more unceremoniously back to the barracks by his tail. He was unconscious and Handy's hammer had made a good show for itself this night. His cloak was bundled under his other arm with his helmet. He made it into the barracks and caught one of the guards who was about to go to sleep. It was the one he had relieved on the first night. He stopped him. Hey! He said. Change of shift, you're back on night duty. He said tiredly. What? The guard Griffin replied. No, I'm not. He protested. Handy raised an imperious eyebrow. Without looking, he reached over to the chalkboard rota beside the doorway, wiped out his own and the guard's pretentious name, Griffinicus Adondis Shadow Sunder, replacing it with Handy's own and putting the guard's name, Griffinicus Adondis Shadow Sunder, in his former place. Handy gave him a look, daring him to object. The griffin's beak was agape, but then he closed it and sighed in defeat before walking off. Handy dumped Tanny S'more beside his cot as he sat down on his own, fuming silently for a while. 2 more days, Handy, just 2. You have the day off tomorrow, go into town, see the sights, scare the bejesus out of some ponies, you'll feel right as rain in no time. He said, rubbing his eyes, dreading waking up in the morning with another god-awful unexplained headache. He could no longer blame the guy sleeping above him, as he had long since learned his lesson, and now there was that goat. Dragon. Unicorn. Dualicorn? Thing that just fucked up his favorite cloak. He liked that cloak, it was best cloak, he sighed looking down at the pink bundle. You see, now he would have to burn it. Nah, he could just dye it again, sure it might ruin it, but it was an awesome cloak and it had served him well. It deserved a second chance. He unfolded it to look at the design on its back one last time. A large red heart and flower designs graced the back of the cloak where his sigil once lay, outlined in white frilly cloth. There were no words to express the internal scream of fury that rocked his entire being that night. Dash equals dash. Really? Really? But look, it'll be fine. Are you sure? You've been in that armor for a week straight and you stink. Oh, I'm sorry, was I the only one in the makeshift sauna that was the negotiations? We all stink, Joachim. Still, this will be fine. I'll be with Thunderstorm all day and we'll have plenty of protection. The rest of the nights have the day off. Go have some fun. Define fun? This is Equestria and I am Handy. He pointed out. Joachim raised a claw and opened his mouth to speak, then looked up and closed his beak. Point. Look, just relax, you have been in an evil mood lately, and you gave Tannismore a concussion. Don't act like he didn't have it coming. He did, Claw, he did, but still, for a lot of reasons. We could have done without that little incident waking half the castle. It certainly made me feel better about my night, and I'll have you know it was only a quarter. Just go out and relax. Johann said, exasperated. For all our sakes, I'd rather not have you glowering over my shoulder on the flight home. But I'll be wearing my happy face then. Your happy face is a terrifying mask of steel. Joachim pointed out. Handy beamed at him. The bird rolled his eyes. He left the room as Handy fixed his double-buttoned jacket over his dress shirt. He affixed his hammer to his belt and swung his shield over his back, hooked into a clip that allowed an easy detachment on the black leather belt he wore across his torso. He harumphed, disliking being this far from safe territory in anything but his heavy armor. He had, despite Joachim's insistence, worn his mail under his outfit. It was an uncomfortable fit, but he pulled it off without making it too obvious. Bewilderingly, his cloak was saved from its date with the bonfire of hatred, having faded back to its normal black and white over time. Although the colors were now reversed, Handy wasn't sure how he felt about that, as if he didn't stick out enough already. He silently cursed magic users and their shenanigans as he affixed it about him. He had to tighten the clasps and heft the hem of the cloak into tiny clips in its underside. Now that he was out of his armor, the cloak dragged terribly on the ground and it'd be ruined had he done naught about it. He'd commission another one, might as well have more than one, he could certainly afford it. He patted the pack bag carried at his side, with its precious cargo of vital fluid. He did have rather a lot of money, so he had purchased several paper bonds recognized by the Royal Treasury of Gethrenia, as regulated by the Central Toll of Grey Coast, whatever that was. He couldn't very well go throwing about changeling coinage in Canterlot, and if he had brought Griffin coinage, he'd probably be ripped off at the exchange rate, and he sure as hell wasn't getting it exchanged for local currency. So, after having made some inquiries with Ivorybeak before he left, he had bought the bonds, about 300 bits worth, which he could easily afford. The bonds were recognized in Equestria, whose local and national treasuries also dealt with the Central Toll of Grey Coast, so at least he could rely on a semi-formal exchange rate for his bonds when he actually bought something. Who knows, maybe Canterlot has some interesting bric-a-brac shops in its dingier streets, like Dublin does. Sighing, he made his way out of the castle. Several of the guards looked expectantly as they heard him approach. He saw looks of disappointment on their faces. Fuckers can get their own pink cloaks, dicks. When they weren't making disappointed expressions, they were looking curiously, having never seen the human without his helm. He had his hood up so it was still heavily shadowed. If any of the ponies were going to get a good look at him, they'd have to be really obvious about it, and none of them felt like getting a chewing out from their superiors for such lack of professionalism. That was just fine with the human. He stopped as he passed by a certain guard pony doing his rounds on the grounds. He carried a spear in the crook of his forehoof. Handy recognized that stern expression. "Hello again, white boy." Handy gave a sly smirk, raised 2 fingers of his left hand to his forehead and gave the Pegasus a quick, dismissive salute. The pony glared at him as he passed. Handy felt naked being out in public without his full armor on, his cloak and mail being small comfort, once he passed out of the castle and into Canterlot proper, that sensation became all the more apparent as he elicited more stares from the gentlefolk of the city and its urbane yet less well-off classes. He shifted uncomfortably, walking slowly through the busy streets, avoiding the carriages and wagons passing to and fro on their respective businesses. The ponies generally parted to give him way and then whispering furiously to one another when he had passed. You know, he had thought they were all stuck-up nobles, but no, most of the ponies were indeed relatively wealthy to some degree, but the stuck-up nature applied to everyone, as he had learned walking into a bakery and purchasing a hot bagel, not caring for the dismissive attitude the baker gave him. He had grunted and was rewarded when the baker broke character for a moment and flinched. Honestly, he was at a loss for what to do with himself. Get out of the castle? Check. Get away from the griffins? Check, although he wasn't sure about leaving Johann alone, but he was with the other kings so he could forget about his duties for once. Aeon scared the bejesus out of some ponies? Handy turned to look across the street. A pair of ponies, filly and colt, teens if he could gauge pony ages by looking, were standing at a corner staring at him. He smiled and they suddenly found somewhere else they'd rather be with priceless expressions. Check and check. Now he was bored. Idly he stopped by a bookstore, the Wilted Quill judging by the sign, and decided to enter. The book mare nearly had a heart attack when the human entered. He calmed her with his best reassuring tone and dignified airs. He was, after all, only browsing to pass the time. He had a look through the shelves. There did not seem to be any organization by genre. Rather, books were stuffed into shelves haphazardly with piles on the floor. The place smelled musty as any proper bookstore should. Handy smiled. It reminded him of some of the hole-in-the-wall bookstores he had drudged through many's a night back home during his own studies, filled with second-hand well-worn copies of old edition textbooks he purchased because he was too cheap to buy the newer, barely improved editions at full price. Those were surprisingly good nights and he had made good finds. Idly he whiled away an hour among the shelves, the mare relaxing slightly over time to return to her own book and cup of tea. Pony literature was a hodgepodge affair, a lot of texts and treatises on everything from advanced astronomy to the proper way to pat down grass seeds according to various earth pony traditions. Most of those did not catch his eyes apart from a small book on equestrian criminal law and jurisprudence. He only half realized he picked it up by some old training kicking in from his university days when he caught himself. He chuckled lightly at his own foolishness and thought about replacing the book. Nah, he missed having something to read, even if it was something as dry as pony law. He decided to try to find any fiction. He was disappointed to learn that pony fantasy stories were generally, surprisingly mundane. That's probably what happened when you already live in a world that was a fantasy buffet anyway. A fair number of the ones he found had a consistent theme: magic creature X, usually a pony goes to world Y which has no magic, shenanigans Z ensue. He bought one of them on sheer ironic principle given his situation. He came across one series of books around a central character, Daring Do. There were rather a lot of books about this character's adventures and he was reminded an awful lot about those penny dreadful, happy-go-lucky adventure stories he had read in primary school. Reading the blurb of one he discovered it was actually more akin to Pony Harry Potter, if Harry Potter was Indiana Jones, despite the titular character being a Pegasus and not a unicorn. Hang on a tick, that actually sounded pretty fucking awesome. He read the first few pages. It wasn't too exciting, but there was plenty of blood and thunder undercurrents he usually enjoyed in his love affair with bad schlock fiction. It was no warmer, but clearly it had plenty of cheese. It'd do for now until he found something better. He made a mental note to check bookstores in Skymount when he got back. He turned and approached the counter. The elderly-looking mare visibly shrank under him, but he tried to give her a reassuring smile, remembering to cover his teeth. When that didn't work, he let go and simply placed the books on the counter and requested a price before handing over one bond note for an exchange of quite a bit of bits. The books were placed in a bag and he thanked the mare for her assistance. He turned to look at the door as a little bell rang, signaling another customer. An extremely haggard-looking mare stood there, muddy hooves, ruined mane, wide, wild-looking eyes and a ragged coat, she looked at Handy disbelievingly. Handy swore he remembered her from somewhere but he couldn't quite place where. Her mane was brown and her coat was red. Crimson, one might say.